Hey everybody, Plushie here. With a move that nobody saw coming, Lysenko dropped a Lost Belt 7 Part 2 servant before the chapter even came out, which is of course Nitocris Alter. Now this character has generated a lot of talk among the community, whether she's the Spishtar killer or not. Well, let's take a look at her skills and MP and let's find out. Nitocris Alter's first skill is a 3-turn 30% Buster and Arts duo buff, and she also gives herself a 3-turn heal per turn effect that heals her by 2000 HP every single turn, all on a 6-turn cooldown. The Buster up is most likely going to be a waste, considering Nitocris Alter only has one Buster card and has a triple Arts deck, and the Arts up is pretty okay. It does help her refund, and it also helps her face cards, but it is only 30%, so it's nothing to really be impressed at. The heal per turn is actually quite large, especially when you're soloing and you pair it up with a heal up CC. She can heal up to 10,000 HP across 3 turns, but normally it's just going to be a slow heal that accumulates into 6k, and it's also on a 6-turn cooldown, so it's not that amazing. Personally, I think this skill is really mediocre, and I would have preferred if the Buster up didn't exist and the Arts up was a little bit larger, or it has a shorter cooldown. Her second skill is perhaps the biggest reason why people are even discussing whether she's gonna kill Space Ishtar or not, because in good old Nitocris fashion, she has a 100 MP battery. On top of that, she also has a apply good alignment to all allies for a single turn, increases party's buff success chance rate by 40% for a single turn, and also applies evil trait to all enemies for a single turn, and finally reduces enemies' buff success chance rate by 20% for a single turn. Now first and foremost, it is a 100 MP battery, so it's going to be super good. It makes her extremely versatile and flexible in any form of farming team, and it helps her fire off her MP immediately without the need of unlocking append skills or bringing certain chargers or CEs. Obviously, I don't think I can praise a 100 MP battery enough. Let's just leave it at that. The give party good attribute for a single turn is basically strictly for her skill 3. The only other synergy I can think of is Archer Jean's Charisma and Arcuate's buff removal resist buff on good allies, but that really isn't that notable of a synergy, so let's just also leave it at that. The buff success chance rate up by 40% for the entire team also is basically for her skill 3, but it does have the added effect of helping servants that have other chance skills, such as Nero or other characters with Imperial Privilege. Back in the day, people do use Ozymandias, who also has this effect with people with Imperial Privilege to guarantee them hitting, but I don't think in this day and age it's really a worthy bring just to have that happen. And if you really want to do that, Ozzy is probably going to be a better choice anyways. Inflicting evil alignment on all enemies is a synergy that is supposed to work with her MP, but it actually has quite a bit of other synergies, since there are quite a bit of good anti-evil servants that are also arts, such as Estrella, who has a really high anti-evil power mod on her MP, or Rasputin, our most recent addition to the SSR roster, also is arts AoE and has an anti-evil damage mod. So you can definitely spawn some interesting teams with those. However, this only lasts 1 turn and it is on a 7-turn cooldown, so I don't think this is too amazing of a combo, but it is fun to think about if you put them in the same team. And finally, reducing all enemies' buff success chance rate by 20% is basically a super bad version of a buff block. It does last for an entire turn though, so it's not just 1 time, but also you have to consider it is only 20%. So it's most of the time not going to stop the enemy from actually applying their buffs. So this is way too RNG to me to be a actual decent effect, especially considering it's also on a 7-turn cooldown. Overall, this skill is already a good skill just from the 100 MP battery alone. However, you will actually see some problems with the skill because so many of these effects have synergy with her skill 3, but they're also tied to a 7-turn CD skill due to the skill being nerfed for having a 100 MP battery. So it's kind of a annoying thing we'll get into later. Nitocris Alter's third skill is an AoE 20% arts up for 3 turns, and it also has a 60% chance to apply the following 3 effects to all good attribute allies. A 1-time 3-turn evade, a 1-time 3-turn debuff immunity, and a 1-time 3-turn death immunity. Now on the surface, this skill is super stacked with a really short cooldown of 5. The AoE 20% art sub for 3 turns is a pretty decent buff on a DPS. It really reminds me of Rasputin's skill 2, but it is also really not that high, so she won't be a supportive character anytime soon just because of this effect. The other 3 effects seemingly are very catered towards high difficulty quests, however do note that all of them are only 1 hit or 1 time. So this is not going to do well against debuff spamming enemies, nor is it going to do well against insta-death spamming enemies. This skill is only really good at countering AoE MPs that also cast insta-death or debuffs, so I don't really think of it that high in terms of high difficulty quest support. And the biggest problem with this skill is actually the fact that it requires good attribute allies for these to apply to, and also it only has a 60% chance to land. This is definitely designed to pair up with her battery skill to use on the same turn, so she guarantees all these effects happening. However, the battery skill has a 7-turn cooldown, so this skill essentially has a fake cooldown timer at 5. Obviously, you can just use it for the arts up, but you know, if you really want full potential and you really want to argue that this skill is good for high difficulty support, you do have to wait 7 turns. And the funniest thing is that Nitocris herself is chaotic evil, so she can't even apply this to herself at a 60% chance without her skill 2. And finally, Nitocris Alter's MP is an AoE 4-hit arts MP that deals 150% extra damage against man-trade enemies, and it casts a 50% insta-death on all enemies, and then follows it up with a 100% insta-death on all evil enemies. And finally, the overcharge of the MP is a 10% MP damage up that happens before the MP that only lasts a single turn, that scales up to 30% at OC5. Nitocris Alter has a relatively low MP gain rate at 0.37 with a 4-hit MP. This is by no means unworkable, however when you compare her to her other 2 peers, Summer Kama and Space Ishtar, her refund is going to feel a little bit low. Obviously that is to balance out her massive 100 MP battery as well as her triple arts deck. The 150% anti-man damage is pretty decent. Technically it is against 1/3 of the entire roster. However, there's a small thing to note that there is a attribute triangle on top of the class advantage system in FGO. Nitocris, being a Sky Servant, actually deals only 0.9 times damage to man-trade enemies, so you're not getting the full 150% anti-trade damage, which is kind of a shame. Nitocris Alter is pretty unique in the sense that she casts 2 insta-deaths. The first 50% insta-death against all enemies is quite low compared to base form Nitocris and Dolman. However, you can easily guarantee the second 100% insta-death to happen if you use her skill 2. However, there are math that proves that a 50% insta-death added to a 100% insta-death is worse than a straight up 150% insta-death. I might make a separate video explaining the math, but I guess for now you just have to take my word for it, making her insta-death still worse than Dolman even though it only lasts a single turn. Which I don't think it's that big a problem considering Nitocris doesn't really get counterclassed, so Dolman's need for insta-death on night classes doesn't really apply on Nitocris. And finally, her overcharge effect is extremely lame. It is the lame type I've complained about on a lot of recent servants, and it's even lower. It's only 10% to 30%, which is extremely low, and it doesn't help considering she already has pretty low damage. So how good is Nitocris Alter? Well, there are a couple of different aspects we can explore when trying to answer this question. And first of all, let's talk about her farming, as this is probably the aspect that most people care about. Well, overall, she is a very competent farmer. She's able to work on basically every single class in normal looping conditions, and even has an advantage when facing very low enemy counts due to her massive MP battery and her less reliance on MP refund. However, not necessarily a con, but due to how arts looping works, you usually want to use Castoria's skill 2 as early as possible because it also has a MP gain up buff, so you want to gain as much extra refund in the following 2 waves. However, Nitocris having a 100 MP battery is really clunky. Most of the times you do want to use it on turn 1, but that means you lose out on refund bonus from Castoria's skill 2, and if you vice versa uses Castoria's skills first, then in the following turn 2 or turn 3, whenever you activate the battery is going to be overkill, as you will have some refund from the previous turn. Now, once again, is this a big problem? Not really, because you can always just make it work with different skill activations, and the most important part is whether you can actually farm the node, which the answer is usually yes, but you just have to sort of change up your way of farming if you are already used to Space Ishtar or Summer Kama farming. In most scenarios, the 100 MP battery does not create an advantage over her competitors due to her having a lower MP refund to compensate it. And once again, as I've said before, the only scenarios where Nitocris is going to have advantage is on very low enemy count nodes, such as a 111 node, where at that point, you might as well be using a single target, so I really don't want to count this as an advantage for her. But I think her biggest problem is her low damage compared to her other two peers. I have a spreadsheet made here. I will briefly explain the criteria here. Basically, I am assuming double Castoria on a MP2 servant with no CE and no external Mystic Code buffs. For Space Ishtar, I had basically two situations, whether she lands or miss the skill 3 buff, and whether she gets to use her MP 2 times or 3 times, because sometimes in multi-core farming or 90++, you only get to use her MP twice, and her MP is a damage ramp-up effect. And for Kama, of course, we have the charm landing and the charm missing, and also when you just don't use the charm skill at all, which is usually on a earlier turn. And for Nitocris, it is just anti-man and not anti-man. And as you can see here in this spreadsheet, Nitocris Alter's damage is considerably lower, especially on the deciding turn, which is usually turn 3, compared to her other two peers. Even when she's anti-man, she does not out-damage a fully ramped up Space Ishtar, nor does she out-damage Kama with the charm landing. So you're going to face a lot of damage problems, because even when you're anti-trading, your damage is still lower. That means your standard damage is going to be even more disappointing, which I did list out here as well. So overall, you might even need a higher MP level Nitocris to compare to the other two, which is kind of an unfortunate fact. This is definitely why, in my opinion, she is not a Space Ishtar and Summer Kama killer, and she ranks below the other two options. I left out Summer Ibuki in the comparison chart as she's a berserker, and I've been reminded by fellow FGO tuber Mist that it is a little bit unfair to compare berserkers with Avengers. However, do remember that when Summer Ibuki came out, she threatened to overtake Space Ishtar and Summer Kama in both the refund and damage department. So you know the differences between Ibuki and Nitocris is just going to be even larger. All of that being said, she is only underperforming relative to the top 3 best arts loopers in the entire game. Her damage is still naturally going to be higher under neutral situations when compared to other classes because she is an Avenger, and she still can loop basically against every single class in normal conditions if you use the correct combinations of supports and Mystic Codes. So she is still very, very good. It's just that relative to the tippy top of the pyramid, she is a little bit lower. Finally, her insta-death is pretty decent. Usually you only rely on insta-death for one wave anyways. However, I think her other supportive abilities are not nearly as powerful as Dolman, so I really wouldn't rank her nearly as high when compared to Dolman in that situation for multi-core farming. And speaking of multi-core farming, obviously she technically does have better flexibility because of her 100 MP battery. However, her only other buff to the entire team is an AoE 20% arts up, which is not a lot. And for multi-core arts farming in particular, you usually bring Castoria anyways, and Castoria's first skill paired up with a maxed out append skill is another 50 MP charge. So a lot of the times you can still fit Space Ishtar or Summer Kama in the same position regardless. Then let's talk a little bit about high difficulty quest performance. Despite her third skill being a very strong counter against certain MPs that have additional effects, it is overall not a very impactful support skill in my opinion, due to all the effects being only one time, minus the arts buff, and how painfully long the cooldown really is, which is 7 turns because you have to pair it up with her skill too. Her second skill certainly creates some interesting synergies with servants like Astrea, Rasputin, as I mentioned before, and also Beniema and Bakken, who are also anti-evil that I forgot to mention earlier. However, due to once again how short it lasts, 1 turn, and how long the cooldown is, 7 turns, it is in my opinion at most a fun niche where you sometimes get to boost your damage in 90++ farming nodes instead of an actual good synergy that you can build a team around. As a main DPS, her only advantage in my opinion is her anti-man attribute damage. However, there is a small problem with anti-man, which is Koyanskaya of Light. Koyanskaya of Light's skill 2 provides a massive power mod against man attribute enemies. So when you're trying to fight specifically anti-man, you might just bring a normal Buster Servant and pair with double Koyan, and they will probably do more damage than a specifically anti-man quick or art servant. One thing to note, however, which is actually kind of rare for art servants these days, is having a triple arts deck. So if you're using her as a main DPS in a more stally composition, is able to chain arts chains even easier with this servant because she effectively has 4 arts card when counting her MP card as well. So that is a really small edge, but I feel like in some cases you actually feel pretty noticeable. And finally, she is chaotic evil, and as always I have to bring up the Dolman synergy. Even though she is an art servant, there are a couple of art supports that does allow you to crit, that has star bombs and all that, so she can actually pull off a pretty nasty crit turn if you have Dolman. All in all, Nitocris is still a very powerful servant, but unfortunately born under an extremely competitive card type and MP type. Her huge battery is the least useful in arts looping. As I've mentioned before, big batteries are usually really clunky in arts looping. Had she been a Buster Servant, she'd be changing the Buster looping meta and making a certain Moon Priestess extremely sad. However, life is life, and she is designed as an AoE arts. Obviously, if you don't have any of the Omni arts loopers, I think you can actually try to pull for her because she is quite decent and she can still work in most situations. Just note that she might have low damage if you only have MP1. One more small note before I end the video is that people tend to tell me she is a perma servant, therefore she is more accessible and easier to raise her MP levels. I completely disagree. Unless you're a huge whale, it is highly unlikely to have many spook servants, let alone a specific one in such a huge servant pool. I actually argue that she might be even less accessible to small spenders, as she will not appear in GSSR pools because she's a perma servant and GSSR are usually always limited servants. Do note that she will appear in every year's Valentine's banners though, so I guess at least every year you will have a chance to get her. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I apologize for the delay, and I'll see you guys in the next one, and good luck on pulling for Nitocris Alter.